So, this is the second part of our Game of Thrones journey, picking up where we left off at Season 4, the era when this show was at the absolute peak of TV history. From Season 1 to 4, everything was just phenomenal. Ned Stark's death, the Red Wedding, Tyrion's brilliance, it felt like the show could never decline. But then came Season 5, and that's where a new story began. One with some incredible moments and some absolute garbage ones. Season 5 gave us that Walk of Shame masterclass. And then in Season 6, Cersei blowing up the Sept of Baelor to showcase her power. That scene was badass beyond belief. Tyrion teaming up with Daenerys, the battle in Meereen with dragons raining fire, that was unreal. And then we got the most jaw-dropping cinematography of the entire show in the Battle of the Bastards. But after that, the show started to decline, slowly but surely. Season 7 still had some highlights. The action and spoils of war was insane, and Arya and Sansa taking down Littlefinger was satisfying as hell. But even then, it didn't feel like the old Game of Thrones anymore. The biggest reason? The writing took a massive nosedive. Even though the cinematography, visuals, and acting in these seasons were still top-notch. But the writing was gradually ruining everything. Jon Snow's dumb beyond-the-wall trip, Tyrion's brain disappearing. It was all starting to frustrate the audience big time. These were hints of the disaster to come, which we'd see full-blown in Season 8. Despite all this, fans still had sky-high hopes for the final season, Season 8. And then it dropped, and it was an absolute disaster. Arya killing the Night King, Daenerys torching King's Landing for no logical reason, Jaime dying under a pile of bricks, Jon's robotic, I don't want it nonsense. This season did some serious damage to Game of Thrones' legacy. Seasons 5 and 6 had a ton of amazing stuff, like Cersei's revenge, Daenerys flying her dragons for the first time, and Jon and Sansa taking back Winterfell. But they also started slipping with some trash moments. Tyrion turning into an idiot, the invention of plot armor, and rushed writing. Then Season 7 had a few good moments, but the pacing was rushed to death. And Season 8, that was the peak of the disaster. So what in the seven hells did David and Dan do to turn a show that had been dominating TV into the most botched final season ever? Today, we're diving into this weird journey from Season 5 to 8 of Game of Thrones. So my name's Tanum, and you're watching another video of Movie Mind 17. It's pretty wild how, back in Season 4, the subplots were at their peak, like I mentioned in the last video. But by Season 5, they just weren't as engaging anymore. To me, the biggest reason these storylines stopped hooking us was that the show no longer felt like a chess game. Early on, it seemed like the characters were constantly scheming, making smart moves to outwit their enemies. But now, it started feeling like events were just happening randomly, and we were only watching how the characters dealt with the fallout. Naturally, the biggest debate people always bring up is that Benioff and Weiss ran out of books to adapt, and that's why the quality declined in these seasons. Back in 2011, George R.R. Martin released the 5th book in his series, A Dance with Dragons, which mostly lines up with Season 5. But David Benioff and D.B. Weiss ignored huge chunks of that book. So the main reason the quality of these subplots got so messy was that they started ignoring a lot from the books and began creating stuff on their own. The books were introducing a ton of new characters at this point, but the showrunners were in a rush to wrap things up. By the time we hit Season 6 and 7, it was almost entirely material they had to come up with themselves. Sure, they knew some key moments were coming because they'd talked to Martin about where the story was headed. But the details, the little nuances that made those events so brilliant, was missed by Benioff and Weiss, and they had to build everything from scratch. George R.R. Martin used to write one episode per season for the first 4 seasons, but that stopped with Season 5. So, it's easy to say the lack of source material to adapt, and Martin's absence dragged the show's quality down. But I'm not going to pin it all on that, because even in these seasons there were still some incredible moments. So, let's take a look at a few storylines. First up, we'll head to the Wall, where Stannis Baratheon's arc completely fizzled out. For a bunch of episodes, he's just hanging out at the Wall and no one knows what he's even doing there. Yeah, he had a couple of scenes with Jon Snow where he offers to make him a Stark, which I think was an interesting twist for Jon's character. But beyond that, Stannis wasn't up to much. It was honestly kind of sad to see them waste a character as great as Stannis like that. But Season 5 had some moments so incredible that you just can't overlook them. For instance, the character development for some of these characters kept going strong in a way that was fascinating in so many respects. Though that doesn't apply to Tyrion, but we'll get to that later. In the early seasons, we got to understand and know these characters, who they are at their core, and then they went through incidents that were absolutely crucial for their growth. But after Season 4, we started seeing how these character transformations impacted their decisions. Jon Snow's storyline in this season was especially gripping. One of his most badass moments came when Janos Slynt refused to follow his orders, and because of that, he got a death sentence. Justice is a rare thing in Game of Thrones, and Janos Slynt, the guy who betrayed Ned Stark back in Season 1, finally met his end at the hands of Ned Stark's son. Then there's the Hardhome episode. I loved how David and Dan perfectly balanced action and tension here. The meeting at Hardhome, followed by the fight against the Army of the Dead and taking down White Walkers, was just phenomenal. Hardhome is hands down one of the most iconic episodes of the entire show. It was the first time we really saw the terrifying power of the White Walkers up close. This episode was critical for their development as a threat. These were the dangers introduced in the very first scene of the series, and for the first time, we got a real sense of the destruction they could unleash. Speaking of Jon Snow, after becoming Lord Commander, we got our first look at how he performs as a leader. He made some tough calls, like bringing the wildlings south of the Wall and integrating them into the Seven Kingdoms. That decision didn't sit well with his Night's Watch brothers at all, and the consequence was that they ended up killing him for it. This hammers home the show's main theme once again: every action has consequences. When it comes to Tyrion and Jorah Mormont, it really felt like the dialogue was starting to lose its spark here. Tyrion's true strength, his brilliant, sharp-witted lines, began to crumble. In the earlier seasons, his travels with Bran were full of comedy and clever exchanges, but with Jorah, that was completely missing. Another trend that kicked off this season was Tyrion cracking cock jokes at Varys every chance he got, followed by Varys giving a disappointed or irritated reaction. That's pretty much all we got from them in the first few episodes. I think this is where Tyrion's character started to decline, because David and Dan just couldn't write dialogue as brilliantly as George R.R. Martin. And all this happened because in this season they tried veering off a bit from the books. On top of that, you had Jaime's Sand Snake subplot, Sansa's torture with Ramsay, Daenerys dealing with the Sons of the Harpy, and Brienne of Tarth just waiting around for Sansa to light a candle. None of these were all that impressive. The Sand Snake's characters were portrayed in a totally butchered way. Jaime failed at a kidnapping, got captured, and then somehow, when he asked the King of Dorne for Myrcella, the guy just agreed. That was hands down the dumbest thing in the entire show up to that point. Sansa's torture by Ramsay was hard to watch, not because it was shocking, but because we'd already seen that drama play out with Theon. And Daenerys' enemy was this vague organization, the Sons of the Harpy, where the writers couldn't drum up any interesting conflict. Honestly, who cares if one of the Sons of the Harpy gets a fair trial or not? But yeah, that subplot did get a little interesting toward the end. That Drogon action scene was absolutely insane. When Drogon swoops in and torches the Sons of the Harpy, that moment was straight up iconic. I loved how Daenerys reconnected with her dragon. It was real proof of her power. It showed exactly why people call her the Mother of Dragons. And sure, Tyrion meeting Daenerys was decent enough. Here you had two of the show's best characters finally coming together for the first time. But that scene didn't hit as hard as it could have, and the biggest reason was the dialogue. This was one of those Season 5 moments that sparked a ton of hope for the future. Speaking of Cersei, it's really hard to feel sympathy for her because she creates so much unnecessary conflict, especially when Margaery and Tommen were perfectly happy together. But then came Cersei's walk of shame. That scene genuinely shook me. Sure, Cersei has done a ton of awful things, but the way she was humiliated made me feel at least a little bad for her. Lena Headey's performance was just phenomenal. Every emotion was crystal clear on her face. That was one of the best parts of Season 5. Arya's training storyline started off interesting, but then it just turned into watching her scrub floors. What could have been the coolest subplot ended up totally wasted. Overall, all these subplots got really messy when it came to writing and creating engaging conflicts. Another thing that started this season was forced character deaths for the sake of action and shock value. David and Dan, the showrunners of Game of Thrones, killed off a cunning character like Sir Barristan Selmy for no good reason. He doesn't even die at this point in the books. The biggest problem with this forced death is the ripple effect it had on all of Daenerys' subplots. Sir Barristan was an anchor for her, someone who showed her the better side of life. And even if you take out that ambush scene, nothing in the Meereen storyline really changes. Barristan dies, Grey Worm gets injured, and that's it. No real impact. This kind of writing is the complete opposite of what we got in the early seasons of Game of Thrones. Season 1 had two major action scenes, both with tons of buildup and lasting consequences for the story. Bronn saved Tyrion in a trial by combat, and Jaime fought Ned Stark over Catelyn kidnapping Tyrion. Those scenes had purpose, buildup, and impact on the characters. Compare that to this Sons of the Harpy action scene. which was just thrown in there with a key character dying for no reason. David and Dan took the easy way out instead of writing a scene that checked all 3 boxes like in Season 1. Back then, there was less action because the writing and dialogue were so strong. But here, without George R.R. Martin's dialogue to lean on, they shoved in these forced action scenes to make the season feel more exciting. The most important part of good writing is that it has a purpose: to develop characters, move the plot forward, and build the world they live in. Take Littlefinger, for example. In Season 5, he got a ton of screen time, but his actions went against his smart, calculating nature. Selling Sansa to Ramsay was a dumb decision. You don't get rid of the last person with Stark blood, especially someone who also saw you kill Lysa Arryn. They had a golden opportunity here to develop both Littlefinger and Sansa's characters, but instead, we got Littlefinger's idiotic plan and more torture for Sansa. I mean, after seasons of Sansa being tortured in King's Landing, this was a chance for her character to breathe a little, but they wasted it. In the books, Sansa never even returns to Winterfell to marry Ramsay. That was a change David and Dan made, probably because they didn't know what else to do with her. On top of that, they completely cut Bran's storyline from this season. Bran's arc had gotten so interesting at this stage because he could travel anywhere in time. He could have shown us answers to any mystery in this world. Sure, that happened in Season 6, but imagine if they'd pushed his story forward in Season 5. We could have gotten a ton of answers about the White Walkers. They had a perfect chance here to dive deep into the White Walkers' mystery, but in Season 6, we only got one scene about their origin. Plus, Bran could have had some solid training to become the Three-Eyed Raven. But for some reason, David and Dan dropped it and left Bran out of Season 5 entirely. I think they just couldn't come up with a good story, so they gave us a shortened version of his journey in Season 6. Overall, it shows that David and Dan aren't great writers. Character development, plot setup, world building, they wasted it all. Another thing that disappointed a lot of people was Stannis Baratheon's death. Him dying by Brienne of Tarth's hand and losing the war was fine, but the build-up to that conclusion was awful. Stannis doesn't do much of anything this season, like I mentioned earlier, and that directly affects his ending because there was no interesting build-up to it. Look at his defeat at King's Landing. That fight had incredible build-up. Every dialogue scene, deciding to kill his brother, plotting with the Red Woman, using black magic, clashing with Davos, and pushing forward even after losing half his fleet, made his loss so much more impactful. But in Season 5, most of it happened off-screen. Like, his army just deserted him in the night. Melisandre walked off without a word, and the weather defeated a battle commander like Stannis. How dumb is that? Then there's the depressing moment with Shireen's death, where Stannis sacrificed his own daughter to the Lord of Light. Loving Shireen was the one thing that made me like Stannis. That scene genuinely broke my heart, and this didn't even happen in the books. There, Shireen, her mom, and the Red Woman were still at the wall while Stannis and Davos marched on Winterfell. And then comes Jon Snow's death. That was honestly such a powerful, emotional, and iconic scene. It had already been proven that no character in this world was safe, but by this point, Jon Snow had become a huge fan favorite. Still, its impact fades when he comes back to life, and it doesn't really change his character all that much. I did like how they showed the connection between Ollie and Jon Snow, though. If David and Dan had spent more time building up Jon and Ollie's bond, it could have hit even harder. That said, this season did have some great moments, like Cersei's Walk of Shame. The Hardhome episode was absolutely unique. David and Dan deserve props for that one. So yeah, Season 5 had a ton of flaws, but it also had enough positive moments to keep it from being a total disaster. Hardhome, Cersei's Walk, Jon Snow delivering justice, Drogon's action, those were all standout moments. Now let's move on to Season 6. First off, let's talk about the gap in writing quality this season. I mean, scene by scene, even within a single scene, the writing quality swings so wildly that you don't know whether to call the dialogue good or bad. We get some genuinely great moments here that flip into terrible ones in an instant. I'm not going to start with the season's most popular moments. Instead, let's look at some regular scenes. The first example comes from a single scene where Theon supports Yara's claim to the Salt Throne. I really liked this scene. It was satisfying for Theon's redemption arc, showing how far he'd come after betraying Yara back in Season 3. It was a wholesome moment, and a solid payoff for the long history between these two characters. But then the scene gets ruined with Euron Greyjoy's awful entrance. He shows up and starts spewing a bunch of nonsense. The funny thing is, he even admits to killing Balon Greyjoy, and no one seems to care. What, not a single person out of that whole crowd was loyal? Theon raises a good point, and Euron's response? A crude cock joke, followed by even more cock jokes. Wow, David and Dan, what a hilarious humor. I mean, what a brilliant way to introduce a villain. The quality of this scene dropped so fast that the writing's failure was painfully obvious. The second example comes from two back-to-back scenes that are miles apart in quality. First, there's Cersei and Jaime grieving over Myrcella's death. The scene starts off amazing, a slow camera push-in on Cersei as she gradually realizes her daughter is dead. That shot highlights Cersei's emotions. Plus, Cersei opens up about the prophecy concerning her children, and Jaime's reaction is spot on. Then we cut to Varys and Tyrion strolling through Meereen. Why is this scene so bad? Because the dialogue David and Dan wrote for these two is just dreadful.
Because you have no cock.
The show's two smartest characters and their lines turn into childish jokes. These examples reveal some trends in Season 6. David and Dan were running out of source material. They only had an outline for the Winds of Winter. How developed that outline was is a mystery, so this gap in writing quality might just be because David and Dan picked the good dialogue and moments from the outline and filled in the rest with their own stuff. The inconsistency is so frustrating that I don't know whether to like or hate some episodes. One scene has Tyrion cracking a cock joke, and the next, he's dropping a smart line. It feels like David and Dan are just filling in blanks and every blank gets stuffed with garbage. Let's talk about Jaime Lannister. He's sent to Riverrun to end the siege there. The old Jaime might have charged straight into battle, getting a bunch of people killed. But now, he makes a smart decision and ends the siege without any bloodshed. Losing his hand turned him into a better, wiser person. That was the biggest and most positive change in his character. Now, onto Tyrion Lannister, who was the first to get ruined. In the early seasons, Tyrion was the sharpest player in the game. He outsmarted everyone with his mind. Remember, this is the guy who was the biggest reason they won the Battle of the Blackwater. But as soon as he leaves King's Landing and meets Daenerys, he turns into the dumbest person on the show. Every piece of advice he gives to Daenerys just leads to disastrous decisions. Another big weakness in these seasons was the dialogue. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't nearly as intense or engaging as the early seasons. The incidents at the Wall were thrilling, but everything else felt pretty meh. Daenerys' conflicts with the Sons of the Harpy and the Dothraki were decent enough. Dorne's entire plotline was just plain stupid. Arya's training with the Faceless Men started off interesting but later felt dragged out, and the whole High Sparrow drama wasn't all that special either. Speaking of Arya, that play scene in Braavos was hilarious. Her reactions to Ned's death and Joffrey's death were spot on. On an unrelated note, it drives me crazy that a random play in Braavos mentions Tyrion, but by the end of Season 8, the Song of Ice and Fire book doesn't even reference him. Anyway, back to the season's payoffs. They were pretty solid. The Tower of Joy reveal about Jon Snow being a Targaryen, Sansa's revenge, and Sam's path to becoming a maester were all super satisfying. But Arya and Daenerys' big payoffs were so weak that the season ends up feeling mixed. Every episode is stuffed with both great and awful moments, and that inconsistency in quality drags each one down. If you don't watch this season for a while, you forget the bad scenes and moments and just remember the best ones. But honestly, you've got to slog through some garbage to get to the good stuff. Still, Season 6 feels so epic because most of its subplots deliver some kind of major payoff. That's what keeps the excitement alive. After seasons of build-up, we finally get these huge resolutions in Season 6. A big thank you for that goes to Season 5, which set up a ton of groundwork for Season 6. That's why Season 5 felt decent, because it was mostly just build-up. For example, Ramsay torturing Sansa was frustrating as hell, but it made the Battle of the Bastards so much more rewarding to watch. Or Daenerys dealing with the Sons of the Harpy, which led to her victory in Season 6. And Cersei's conflict with the High Sparrow, which ended with the explosion of the Great Sept. But the thing that frustrates me the most, and could have been so much better, is the payoff for Arya becoming a faceless assassin. It starts when the waif is sent to kill Arya because she didn't take out that actress. When the waif stabs Arya, it feels like such a dumb idea. The whole sequence is dripping with plot armor. And this is the storyline where the buildup was just Arya sitting around washing corpses and doing chores. We waited 2 seasons for this, and then Arya kills the waif off-screen and ditches Jaqen, who we never see again after that. Sure, the scene where she kills Walder Frey was absolutely incredible, but that was the last time she ever used those powers. Overall, Arya's payoff was weak, and that's frustrating because, conceptually, this was one of the coolest subplots. Assassins wearing people's faces, how awesome does that sound? Yet it ended up being the least interesting subplot of the season. The only interesting thing that happened with Arya in Season 6 was her killing Walder Frey. When she slit his throat and said her piece, I felt so much joy I wanted to scream.
When people ask you what happened here, tell them the North remembers. Tell them winter came for House Frey.
Seeing Arya take revenge for the Red Wedding, using her training, it was a short scene, but damn, it was powerful. Now, before we get to the next payoff, I know this season has massive moments like the Battle of the Bastards and the Great Sept explosion, but I'll analyze those a bit later since they're considered some of Game of Thrones' most iconic moments. As for the other payoffs, Daenerys defeating the Sons of the Harpy was a decent ending. When the dragons rain fire and Dany showcase her power, that scene was visually top-notch. It shows just how unstoppable Daenerys can be. This was a storyline that had been building for 3 seasons, but the ending wrapped up in just 5 minutes with Dany intimidating everyone into submission. It made all that build-up feel kinda pointless. The 3 master villains weren't developed at all. They barely got any screen time, so Daenerys' victory felt even less satisfying. Compare that to the High Sparrow, who had tons of build-up, with his cunning on display across multiple scenes, making him a truly dangerous villain. It's clear this resolution paled next to the Battle of the Bastards, since they were in the same episode. Wrapping up Daenerys' 3-season arc in 5 minutes didn't do her storyline justice. Yeah, she's super powerful and can end a fight quick, but it deserved more time. Now, speaking of the Tower of Joy, that for me was the biggest plot twist in TV history. A mystery that had been brewing for years finally gets answered, and it's shown in such a beautiful way. That scene with Lyanna Stark, where she tells Ned to protect Jon, it was the most emotional moment of the season for me. It wasn't just a reveal, it gave the entire story a whole new twist. So, taking a break from payoffs and storylines, I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough attention: Season 6's cinematography. For me, it's the most beautiful in the entire show. Whenever I think about Game of Thrones visuals, this season stands out the most. Maybe it's because the budget went up. This season had $10 million per episode, compared to $6 to $8 million before. That bigger budget made sequences possible that just couldn't happen on a smaller scale. The biggest example is the Battle of the Bastards. We all know how epic the cinematography was in that episode. That single shot of Jon Snow standing alone against the enemy horde, it was jaw-dropping. The zoomed-in style of every shot, making the horses feel closer than they really are, Jon and the army's insane clash, and the overall shot composition. Everything was perfect. And that's just one frame. The whole episode is packed with stunning visuals like that. Then there's that long-take tracking shot of Jon fighting his way through the battlefield. We'd never seen anything like it before. Especially we couldn't imagine to watch something like that on a TV show. This incredible cinematography takes the episode quality to another level, because it's so visually captivating. Sure, the Battle of the Bastards has some flaws, I'll get to those later, but its jaw-dropping visuals boost it so much that it becomes overwhelming. And that's just the cinematography of the season's main action set piece. Even the normal dramatic scenes have phenomenal cinematography most of the time. Take Ser Jorah's goodbye to Daenerys. That scene's cinematography is unreal. The medium shots of Daenerys and Jorah, with that smooth, creamy, shallow focus, create this warmth and intimacy between them. For me, it amplifies the emotional punch of the scene. Then, as it progresses to close-ups, you get these detailed emotions captured. Every shot feels like a super detailed painting. The color palette is so satisfying that it applies to almost every dialogue scene. Another example is Kinvara talking to Varys. The same techniques are used here, but the blocking and shot composition have a subtle, yet powerful impact throughout the scene. Varys is criticizing the Red Priests, and when Kinvara brings up his past, the power dynamic shifts toward her. That shift hits visually when she moves closer in the frame. Despite being lower in the shot, she dominates Varys. That scene gave me chills, and the cinematography cranked it up even more, especially with the stellar acting. To back up my claim that Season 6 has the best cinematography, let's compare 2 scenes from different seasons, both at Winterfell. Look at these 2 scenes from Seasons 5 and 6. Right away, you can see that Season 6's lighting is way better. It's so much more intentional, with thought put into where the actors are in relation to the light. In Season 5, characters like Roose Bolton aren't even properly lit. The main light falls on their hands. But in Season 6, every character is brightly lit, creating great contrast. Or the light comes from behind, highlighting their faces. It's obvious these shots are leaps and bounds ahead of Season 5. Personally, I love Season 6's color correction. It feels a bit more saturated. Anyway, overall, Season 6's cinematography is so incredible that it boosts the entire season's appeal, even if some scenes or moments aren't that great. Alright, let's dive into analyzing the 2 most memorable sequences from Season 6, the Battle of the Bastards and the Great Sept explosion. First up, Battle of the Bastards. As I've said before, we got the show's most stunning cinematography here. It's undeniably an incredible action set piece, made even more special by its jaw-dropping visuals. But this is also where we start seeing the element of consequences for actions slowly fading away. One flaw here is the plot armor. Jon Snow's plot armor gets cranked up to ridiculous levels. In the early seasons, there was no such thing as plot armor, but in the Battle of the Bastards, you can clearly see it plastered all over Jon Snow. If any random person walked into the middle of a battlefield facing an entire enemy army, they'd be dead for sure. But not if they're Jon Snow, because he's the main character, right? Season 7 takes plot armor even further, but we'll get to that in a second. Jon falls into Ramsay's trap, survives 8 rounds of arrow barrages, dodges a cavalry charge, makes it out alive after being swarmed by enemies, and even escapes unscathed after being crushed by his own allies. It's absolute madness. At the very least, he should have walked away from that battle with some injuries, but nope, he comes out perfectly fine. Funny thing is, one encounter with Ygritte was more dangerous than running in front of thousands of soldiers. This plot armor goes against what made Game of Thrones special in the first place, the consequences of characters' actions. But Battle of the Bastard boosted Jon Snow and Sansa's character to the whole another level. Sansa not telling Jon about the Vale army doesn't make much sense, but when she swoops in at the last second with the army and crushes Ramsay's forces, that moment was beyond satisfying for me. Seeing a scumbag like Ramsay meet his end, especially at Sansa's hands, was the season's biggest payoff. For me, that scene is Game of Thrones' most satisfying moment.
My hounds will never harm me.
You haven't fed them in 7 days, you said it yourself.
They're loyal beasts.
They were. Now they're starving.
Now, onto the second sequence, the Great Sept Explosion. Of all the episodes in these later seasons, the Season 6 finale felt the most like classic Game of Thrones. Cersei blowing up the Sept of Baelor. That's the real Game of Thrones. She hatched a plan to wipe away all her sins, and that plan was to gather all her enemies in one place and obliterate them. It was truly an iconic and badass scene. Cersei taking out the High Sparrow and his crew in one fell swoop was such a display of power that it cemented her as the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. There's so much to love about it, but for me, it misses one core aspect of storytelling. Once again, the consequences of actions. On its own, this sequence is insanely iconic, but you have to look at it in the bigger picture because this is a long series. Take the Red Wedding, for example. Why was it so memorable? The heart-wrenching twist and its lasting impact on the world. In the next episode, everyone was talking about the Red Wedding. But after the Great Sept Explosion, who's talking about it? Did all of King's Landing just forget this massive event? What happened to that setup from earlier in the season?
Every one of us is poor and powerless. And yet together, we can overthrow an empire.
In reality, the people of King's Landing should have revolted, stormed the Red Keep, like they hinted at in Season 5 with, "You are the few, we are the many."
You are the few. We are the many. And when the many stop fearing the few.
So, all that build-up from Season 5 feels wasted because there's no proper payoff. The explosion's aftermath is just a few minor character mentions and Jaime being upset with Cersei, which cools off pretty quick. The Great Sept Explosion ends up just being a tool to make Cersei queen and delete a few characters. That's its main downside. But there's plenty of good stuff too. For me, the standout is the music. Ramin Djawadi absolutely steals the show in this sequence. Without the Trial of the Seven track, it wouldn't be nearly as iconic.
We all need to leave now!
North. Stay with me.
David and Dan not shoving in dialogue also helps, since that's their weakest link. With less dialogue, the cinematography and score hit their peak. Plus, the pacing of this sequence syncs perfectly with the music. That slow ramp-up as the characters realize what's happening gives you chills. Overall, it's a phenomenal sequence. If Game of Thrones had ended after Season 6, the Great Sept Explosion would have been damn near perfect. When it comes to Season 7, for me, the writing was the biggest villain of the season. It's obvious that this season was incredibly rushed, and that flaw brings a ton of side effects, like rushed writing, breakneck pacing, a lack of interesting dialogue to slow things down, and storylines that don't get fully developed. Before diving into those issues, let me explain why the writing felt so rushed. By this point, David and Dan had become super popular. They were getting big offers from major studios like Netflix and Disney. Between that and their exhaustion, they decided to make 2 shorter seasons, even though HBO and George R.R. Martin wanted 10. Dumb and Dumber also turned down HBO's offer for extra writers and kept full control of Game of Thrones themselves. Combine that with the lack of source material, and it completely screwed over the writing. Now, let's look at the side effects of this rushed writing. The first is pacing. A show or movie's pacing depends on how fast the storylines move forward. In Season 7, they crammed so many story events into 7 episodes that there wasn't even a moment to breathe. In earlier seasons, 10 episodes would have just a handful of major events. And why is that such a bad thing? Because build-up and payoff need balance, and characters need time to develop. Season 2 is a perfect example. I talked about it in Part 1. There, the King's Landing subplot shows Tyrion slowly learning to be Hand of the King while facing the huge challenge of defending the city from Stannis. That was proper build-up that developed Tyrion. But if Season 2 had been done in Season 7 style, Tyrion would have saved King's Landing, married Sansa, gotten blamed for Joffrey's death, and faced a trial, all in one season, turning it into a burnt mess. That's exactly what happened with Daenerys in Season 7. She arrives at Dragonstone, fights a bunch of battles, meets the king in the north, falls in love with him, saves everyone from the White Hunt, and negotiates a ceasefire with Cersei, all in one season. You can see just how insanely rushed this season was. And any dialogue scenes with Dany are mostly filled with Tyrion's repetitive nonsense. Every time, it's the same outcome. Dany became irritated by Tyrion and ignores his stupid advices. That's not character development. Think about it. How much does Daenerys actually change in Season 7? Are you telling me these two fell in love in just 4 scenes, even after Jon's actions got one of her dragons killed? Going from Daenerys' lowest point after losing her child to hot feelings for Jon in 20 minutes, they shredded any sense of emotion, all because of this ridiculously fast pacing. They should have slowed down the pacing so the characters could breathe and show their feelings. In Season 1, when characters traveled from Winterfell to King's Landing, there were tons of journey scenes, showing the passage of time with amazing character and world-building dialogues. But in Season 7, all the main characters basically teleport to King's Landing for the ceasefire deal from one episode to the next. It doesn't even feel like time has passed because there are no dialogue scenes during the journey. They had a golden opportunity here. So many main characters on a ship together, the potential for dialogue was limitless. But David and Dan were in such a rush to wrap up story events and the ending that the pacing got artificially jacked up. They should have slowed it down with interesting dialogue, like in the earlier seasons. Another huge flaw this season was how Cersei's storyline went to waste. By the time we hit Season 7, characters started dodging the consequences of their actions entirely. Cersei blew up one of the holiest buildings in King's Landing and wiped out one of Westeros's most powerful houses. But in Season 7, she faces zero consequences for it. In Season 6, David and Dan made it seem like a big riot was brewing. So when Cersei destroys the Great Sept and everyone starts hating her, it was a perfect chance to develop that storyline. But in Season 7, that whole conflict just vanishes. Like nothing major even happened in Season 6. Cersei's left with just a handful of scenes because her story now boils down to only fighting Daenerys. This all happened because David and Dan didn't give themselves enough time to focus on all the storylines. They just wanted to zero in on one main storyline. That simplified tons of story aspects, like Bran's time travel powers, Arya's faceless assassin skills, the Azor Ahai prophecy, magical elements, and who knows how many other storylines they dropped. Writing a story with fewer complex elements is easier, but it makes Season 7 feel overly simple and dull. In the earlier seasons, everything was thought out and explored in detail, but here, it all gets left half-baked. Let's talk about another major flaw. Dumb and Dumber pushing the story forward without logic or explanation. The biggest example of this is the Beyond the Wall journey to kidnap a White. Most people agree that the dumbest part of Season 7 is that Beyond the Wall trip. The plan to capture a White and take it to Cersei was just a stupid idea. And guess what? It was Tyrion's brainchild. The logic of this plot is pure madness. In what universe would Cersei ever help her enemies? And this terrible plan came from Tyrion, who knows his sister better than anyone? This idiotic logic forced 2 big action and drama set pieces into the story. Let's say George R.R. Martin's story was heading there too. But Dumb and Dumber butchered the execution. They dumbed down Tyrion's brain along with a bunch of other characters. If you look closely at this episode, why didn't Daenerys just grab the Whites with her dragons, or at least make a quick escape plan with them? And did Jon and his crew really think they could snatch a White without the White Walkers noticing? No way. Didn't Jon remember the terror of Hardhome? He barely escaped that sequence alive, and plenty of characters died there. Dumb and Dumber just wanted an epic action scene for fake entertainment, but they failed at that too. If you zoom in on the logic of this scene, every character should have died there, but plot armor saves the day. How convenient is it that the Night King waited a full 24 hours for the ice to freeze when whites can swim? And why didn't he take out Drogon, the easiest target with all the main characters on it? Season 7 is loaded with plot armor and illogical moments like this. In that whole sequence where they're trapped on the ice, it's hard to believe not a single key character died. Jon even stayed back to fight whites alone, fell into freezing water that should have given him hypothermia, and somehow still survived. That's plot armor at its finest. Narratively, it feels like this journey beyond the wall was only thrown in, so the Night King could get a dragon and break the wall. Beyond that, it has no lasting impact on our characters, which is so not Game of Thrones style. Take another example, Daenerys' action scene with Drogon wrecking everything. Jaime wasn't supposed to die or get captured, so they shoved in a dumb scenario where he somehow escapes. Then they needed a Tyrion and Cersei reunion scene to show off some acting, so they turned Jon Snow into an idiot for it. Overall, most story events feel forced, making nothing feel natural. Characters keep doing stupid things just to push the plot along. Dumb and Dumber don't even know how to write main characters. It's sad, because after making so many seasons, they should have been super familiar with the source material. Instead, they start ruining all the characters. First up, Jon Snow. After season 6, this guy just repeats a few lines with zero development. It gets even worse in season 8, but it starts here in season 7. All his dialogue is just to move the plot forward, talking about fighting the Night King, needing allies, or whatever the protagonists need.
When I left Winterfell, I told you we need allies or we will die. But more importantly, we need allies.
I told you we needed allies.
We need allies. Powerful allies.
If we're gonna be allies in this war, it's important for the Northerners to see us as allies.
In the early seasons, he had a distinct personality, but now he feels like a robot. Next is Arya, and it's beyond wrong that she had nothing to do the whole season. Dumb and Dumber dragged her into a stupid drama with Sansa, a conflict Bran could have cleared up in 2 minutes. Since when did she turn into this creepy character who threatens her sister more than Lannister soldiers? It's so frustrating how they wasted a great character like Arya like this. Then there's Sansa. Like Arya, she didn't have much to do all season either. Sure, she became the acting queen of the North and held it together on her own, but the show didn't give her any big challenges to grow. Her only obstacles were Arya and Littlefinger, and no one even knows what Littlefinger was up to most of the time until he got killed. So it wasn't even an interesting challenge. That's another result of rushed writing. But Arya and Sansa taking down Littlefinger? That was insanely satisfying for me. Yeah, their drama was dumb, but when the Stark sisters teamed up to expose Littlefinger and Arya slit his throat, that scene was unreal.
Thank you for all your many lessons, Lord Baelish. I will never forget them.
The North remembers Vibe and the Stark sisters coming together. That moment was pure gold. Now let's move on to the next Stark, Bran. Man, he's turned into a complete douchebag who doesn't care about anything. Mira Reed did so much for him, and he doesn't even say thank you. Bran used to be a good character in the earlier seasons, but now he's become unbearable. He's got nothing to offer the show except revealing Jon's a Targaryen. And aside from using ravens to scout locations, he doesn't even use his powers. That's so unfair to the audience. Next up, Daenerys. There's no room for development in her dialogue scenes. She's just limited to romancing Jon or arguing with Tyrion. Her scenes with Tyrion feel like she's putting him down, which makes sense since she ignores his terrible advices. Maybe the writers wanted to show her as angry and independent, but in the process, they ruined Tyrion. Speaking of Tyrion, he used to be the smartest character on the show, but now he's the dumbest. He can't give Dany a single good piece of advice, like telling her not to use her dragons, attacking Casterly Rock instead of Highgarden, which is Westeros' most valuable spot for food and money, sending everyone beyond the wall to die, and thinking Cersei would help fight the army of the dead. The worst part? There's no reason in the show for Tyrion to turn this stupid. Sure, killing his father broke him emotionally, but his IQ should have stayed the same. Dumb and Dumber just couldn't write him smart anymore.
I suppose we should say goodbye. One idiot to another.
Moving to Cersei compared to seasons 5 and 6, declined a ton this season. In those earlier seasons, she was the protagonist of her own story. Her scenes humanized her, and we couldn't help but feel a connection to her. But now she's back to being the main villain, and those scenes that made us connect with her vanish in season 7. But her revenge on Ellaria Sand was a badass moment. Back in season 5, Ellaria killed Cersei's daughter, and now Cersei put her through the same pain. That scene was both badass and emotional. Surprisingly, Jaime Lannister is the one character this season who didn't get totally wasted because he had an actual character arc. At the start, he's devoted to Cersei, but he ends up deciding to fight for what's right and save people. That transition was great and showed his honorable side. His bravery shown in Spoils of War 2. Knowing he was going to lose, he still fought for his soldiers. That battle gave us an awesome perspective on Daenerys' destruction. When she rolls in with her dragons and starts wrecking everything, it was incredible. Drogon spitting fire, intense music, and Jaime seeing Daenerys' power up close. For me, that was the season's standout moment. Overall, the quality of so many characters dropped off a cliff this season. Whether it's out-of-character stupidity or becoming so dull you start disliking them. For fans who followed these characters for so many seasons, it's really sad, especially since they used to be so amazing. Writing is the basic foundation of any show. If it's bad, the show's doomed, no matter how great the special effects or cool the action is. For me, the grounded and realistic tone of the first 4 seasons, the slow pacing, and the occasional epic action build-up, that's peak Game of Thrones. Not Season 7's overload of action and rushed story. Even though these seasons stumble in places, I wouldn't say anything was so awful it ruined the whole show. Seasons 5, 6, and 7 had their brilliant moments, but it's clear their quality dipped compared to the earlier ones. After Season 7 being just okay, there were still sky-high hopes for the final season, Season 8. Now it's time to talk about Game of Thrones' biggest season, Season 8. Before we dive into analyzing all its mess-ups, let's first look at a few good things this season actually did. The second episode of this season honestly wasn't that bad. It's the only one that takes its time and gives us some fantastic character moments. Game of Thrones shines brightest when characters are just sitting or standing in a room talking. There wasn't any scheming here, but we got to hear what's going on in their heads. Everyone thinks they're about to die, and their attitude toward that situation felt totally realistic. And why wouldn't it? You're about to face the White Walker's army, after all. Brienne being knighted was such a sweet scene. She'd been held back so long just because she's a woman, and now she finally gets her knight status. Then, in the battle, Jorah's death and Theon's death were solid too. Both sacrifices could have been better, but they weren't awful. Another thing I liked was Sansa's story wrapping up. Seeing this girl who once wanted to be someone else's queen ended up becoming the ruling queen of her own home was awesome. It might be the only character arc that didn't get ruined and ended beautifully. And Tyrion's final words to Jaime were super emotional and touching. On top of that, the visual effects this season were insane. The music was phenomenal, especially when the Night King dies. The cinematography was unreal. Every scene, whether it's the long night, King's Landing burning, or Jon Snow heading north in the final shot, looked so stunning it felt like a masterpiece in the making. The lighting, camera work, and visual scale, everything was top-notch. And some moments in The Long Night were so intense. The White Walkers attacking Winterfell, that dark atmosphere, it was gripping. The tension and visuals in that battle were incredible. When the dragons rain fire and Melisandre lights the trenches, those were the best moments of the fight. The music and vibe were just unreal, but that's about it. That's all the good stuff I can remember. Now let's talk about the ton of things that went wrong this season. I'll try to keep it organized and just cover the big issues. Let's start with the simplest and most basic problem. Its structure. Season 8 only has 6 episodes, and for me, that's its biggest weakness. With fewer episodes, everything becomes predictable. We can easily guess what's going to happen in each one. In earlier seasons, with 10 episodes, the story's flow was hard to predict. But why is this season structured like this? Because David and Dan wanted to wrap it up quick, which makes the writing insanely rushed. I mentioned this with Season 7, but in Season 8, these flaws get even worse. Season 7's pacing was fast, but Season 8's pacing is so inconsistent you can't even tell what's happening. Take Episode 4. It starts with a big funeral, then a dinner feast with tons of developments. Gendry becomes Lord of Stormlands. Brienne and Jaime's relationship hits its peak. Bran threatens Tyrion and Jaime over Highgarden. Jon tells Sansa and Arya his true identity. Sansa leaks it. Tyrion leaks it too. Rhaegal gets killed, Missandei gets captured. Varys plots to betray Dany, and there's a surrender deal with Cersei, all in one episode. What the hell is going on? And those are just the major points I listed. Then, in the final episode, the pacing suddenly slows down, which feels so weird because the story was racing before that. For example, what was the point of that long scene with Tyrion fixing chairs? I love slow pacing, but if the scene has no purpose, it's just a total waste of time. If you compare this to Season 2, back then, an entire episode would run on dialogue because it was engaging and deep. But in Season 8, the depth in dialogue just vanished. David and Dan kept switching scenes too fast. Like when Jon Snow tells Daenerys he's a Targaryen, and just as she brings up the throne conflict, the White Walkers show up, cutting short a scene with so much potential. Or Sansa and Daenerys talking. Just as things heat up, Theon pops in out of nowhere and stops everything. This doesn't happen once or twice. It keeps happening again and again. Dialogue scenes in this season are chopped short, making them feel pointless. Without exploration or long dialogues, the scenes feel weak. They just push the story forward without developing characters. Early seasons had weight and depth in their dialogues, but here that's completely gone. Take Jon and Arya's reunion. I was so hyped for it. In season 1, they adored each other. Their chemistry was amazing. But here, they hug, show off their swords, and the conversation shifts to Sansa. The reunion brings some joy, but it fades fast, and instead of interesting dialogue, we get that weird sword-showing moment. David and Dan just didn't know how to write this scene right. After their deep, dark journeys, they finally reunite after all these years, and it ends with a hug and sword flexing. Wow, so emotional. This season's writing is so lazy that instead of crafting new, engaging dialogue, they recycled lines from old seasons.
With a belly full of wine and a girl's mouth around my cock.
With a belly full of wine and a girl's mouth around my cock?
Men decide where power resides. Power resides where men believe it resides.
Power resides where men believe.
Shut your mouth. Now Varys' ashes can tell my ashes. See? I told you.
Because I have balls. And you don't.
Those recycled lines feel awkward and stupid. King's Landing scenes used to have deep lore stories and character-building dialogue. Now it's just basic trash that only moves the plot along. With so many interesting characters, David and Dan still couldn't write decent dialogue, or even include it where it was needed. And they cut out so many important scenes that fans were dying to see. Like skipping the moment Jon tells Sansa and Arya about his true identity. That was so frustrating because you're so excited to see it, and they just skip it. Such a huge reveal, and we don't even get their reactions. They're his sisters, with a deep connection to him now. Seeing their responses would have been fascinating, but we're just left to guess. That's the peak of lazy, rushed writing. Arya and Dany never met in this season. Jaime and Bran's confrontation lasts a measly minute. Bran and Tyrion's conversation gets cut. Sansa and Theon's talk disappears. David and Dan either wanted to wrap it up quick or just can't write good dialogue. Game of Thrones' strongest point was its dialogue, and now it's become its weakest. That's honestly so sad. Now let's talk about this season's plots. Starting with the conclusion of the Night King and the Army of the Dead. From the first episode, 2 plot points were building: Daenerys claiming the Iron Throne and the threat of Army of the Dead. Jon Snow spent the entire show, from the end of season 1 onward, preparing for this threat. Every decision he made was influenced by the Night King's danger in some way, so I think Jon should have been the one to kill him. Would that be predictable? Yeah, absolutely. But at least his character arc would have had some kind of payoff. The whole point of Season 7 was Jon rallying the Lords of Westeros to help in this fight. Jon convinced Daenerys to pause her campaign against Cersei and join him. Jon organized the Dragon Pit meeting to negotiate a ceasefire. Jon brought the wildlings south of the Wall to help in this battle. Jon was the one trying to get people to stop fighting each other and focus on this bigger threat. So even if Jon killing the Night King felt too predictable, whoever killed him should have been at Winterfell because of Jon. The story's whole conclusion should have been that if Jon hadn't united everyone and pushed them to set aside their differences, the Night King would have won. The person killing the Night King could have even been Daenerys herself, since she was there because of Jon. But I think the best option would have been Jaime Lannister. Jaime, who fought against the Starks for so long, saving Winterfell would have been perfect. Jaime, the guy who tried to kill Bran in the very first episode, ending up as the one to save him in the end. He'd be an ideal choice too, because he was the only one who came north after that disastrous King's Landing meeting. Jon Snow went north to grab a white. Daenerys came to rescue them, and one of her dragons died. So much sacrifice just to give Cersei a solid reason for a ceasefire. But the way the story played out, all that sacrifice was for nothing. The campaign to bring a white to Cersei backfired. It didn't gain them anything, and instead handed the Night King a dragon. The only thing that came out of the Dragon Pit meeting was Jaime heading north. But even in the battle, he doesn't do much. If Jaime had killed the Night King, Jon Snow's plan would have meant something. If Jon hadn't gone south to meet Cersei, Jaime wouldn't have gone north to take on the Night King. And if Jaime had died killing him, his character arc wouldn't have been ruined later on. Arya getting to Winterfell, though, had nothing to do with Jon. She just randomly hears that the Boltons are done, and Jon's now king in the north. Some people point to Season 3 foreshadowing, where the Red Woman said Arya would shut Blue Eyes forever. But that's the dumbest reason ever. A random comment's payoff can't outweigh 8 seasons of Jon's development. Are you telling me some words from the Red Woman's mouth trump all of Jon Snow's hard work? Another debate is that Arya trained as a fighter for 8 seasons, and this was her climax. Fine, but her training could have paid off in so many other ways. I don't think killing the Night King was necessary for her. So yeah, Arya taking out the Night King was not a smart way to wrap up a storyline that was set up from the show's very first scene. David and Dan ended the Night King story in the most boring way possible. No depth, no twist to unravel old mysteries. Just a generic battle that was so poorly done, you couldn't even see much. The choreography was a total mess, especially compared to earlier battles that were better on less budget. And logic? It died first in this fight. The Dothraki charging openly at the Whites and dying, despite saying in the meeting they couldn't win a straight fight? Genius.
We can't beat them in a straight fight.
Then Winterfell's people hiding in the crypts with dead bodies lying around. Brilliant. And then Arya kills the Night King. She was never even connected to the White Walkers. Think about it. Was there ever a single mention of them in Arya's story? She had her own arc, her own enemies. The Night King had nothing to do with her, so there's no satisfaction in her killing the show's biggest villain. Compare that to Joffrey and Ramsay's deaths in earlier seasons. Those were so satisfying. For Jon Snow, this would have been an emotional victory. He'd been fighting the White Walkers since season 1. The Night King was his arch nemesis. David and Dan say they wanted a surprise element, but ruining the story for a shock is nonsense. Oh, and the White Walkers' symbols. David and Dan didn't even touch that storyline.
These are patterns that have mystical significance for the children of the forest. We're not sure exactly what they signify, but spiral patterns are important in a lot of different cultures in our world, and it makes sense that they would be in this world as well.
How sad is that? Such cool symbols and they mean nothing. Just thrown in for no reason? Unreal. Let's talk about Jaime Lannister, because his character assassination frustrated me the most. At the end of season 7, Jaime breaks away from Cersei's manipulative games and makes the honorable choice to fight against the army of the dead. What's weird is that the first half of season 8 actually gives him some great moments to wrap up his character arc. Jaime had become someone who valued humility and honor. In King's Landing, he was the only one who kept his word and went north to help the Starks. Once there, he apologizes to Bran and tells Brienne he wants to fight alongside her in the battle. This is the same Jaime who, 7 seasons ago, called Brienne a wild beast. But after the battle, he decides he needs to go back to King's Landing to find Cersei. He leaves Brienne to return to Cersei, and his reasoning is absolute nonsense.
I would have murdered every man, woman, and child in Riverrun for Cersei. She's hateful. And so am I.
He talks about his old sins, but what does that even mean now? We've seen how much he's changed. He helped save Winterfell from the White Walkers, fought his inner demons, and became a good, better, truer person. But then out of nowhere, he says, "I'm hateful, I love Cersei." What kind of joke is this? It completely trashed his arc. His conversation with Tyrion is one of the most emotional scenes and genuinely broke my heart. But when Tyrion says 1,000,000 lives are at stake, and Jaime responds that he never cared about the people of King's Landing, innocent or not.
To be honest, I never really cared much for them. Innocent or otherwise.
What? The whole point of Jaime's story was that his most dishonorable act, killing the Mad King, was actually his most honorable one because it saved millions of lives. And now you're saying he never cared about any of it? Then he goes back to Cersei and dies with her. What's the main point of Jaime's story? We all thought it was about showing that anyone can become better, and it's never too late to start doing the right thing. 8 seasons built that character arc, and they demolished it in a single episode. David and Dan just wanted Jaime to die with Cersei, but in doing so, they completely ruined his character. They could have made it better here too. All they needed was a heartbreaking scene where Tyrion opens Jaime's eyes to Cersei's true nature, and they both realize she has to die, ideally by Jaime's hand. It would have been a mercy for Cersei, better than falling to Daenerys. It would have fulfilled the Valonqar prophecy too. That would have made their ending satisfying and emotional. But what we got was utter garbage. As for Cersei, she's given nothing to do this season. She just stays holed up in the Red Keep, complaining about elephants, kills Missandei, and watches the entire battle from a window. The complex villain from seasons 5 and 6, they've completely ruined her. Cersei and Jaime's conclusion was awful too. When Jaime finally reaches her, he repeats that old "only we matter" line.
Nothing else matters. We're the only ones who matter, the only ones in this world. Until you and I are the only people left in this world.
And then they die under falling bricks. How is that a good ending? Jaime reverts to his old patterns. Cersei just goes into shocked and sad mode. No depth, no satisfaction, no big moment. two of the show's best characters getting such a lousy ending. Someone explain to me how this happened. Now on to Sansa. It might be the only character arc that didn't get ruined and ended beautifully. Her conflict with Daenerys this season is so stupid and annoying. Did Sansa really think Dany couldn't help them in this huge fight? Then she just leaks Jon Snow's identity, and beyond that, she doesn't get any solid moment this season. Early on, there's talk of her managing Winterfell and food supply issues, but all that vanishes off-screen. Where's that smart mind of hers? Where's the scheming she learned from Littlefinger? If we talk about Arya, her revenge arc with Sandor was decent. He taught her what revenge really does. Killing Cersei wouldn't have been right for her anyway, but this scene felt odd too because on one hand, the Hound tells Arya revenge isn't worth it, yet on the other, he goes off to get his own revenge on the mountain. Beyond that, Arya always cherished her family. Her journey was dark, family was her anchor, her normality, especially since two of her family's most painful moments happened right in front of her. Yet in Season 8, she just ignores them. Her reunion with Jon is awkward, she doesn't even talk to Bran, and after the Night King's death, there's no emotional moment with Sansa either.
We're family. The four of us. The last of the Starks.
And her relationship with Gendry was just for sex. She could have stayed with him on her own terms. And after Sandor convinced her to let go of revenge, she should have returned to her family, not set off on some random adventure. Oh right, they had to hint at a spin-off show too. As for Jon Snow, poor guy hasn't had any development since Season 6. He's just a decent character now, one we can't even emotionally connect with anymore. David and Dan gave him just few dialogue options. First is, "You are my queen." Second is, "I don't want it," and a couple more just to push the plot along. Beyond that, he just stands there silently with a confused face.
You are my queen. I don't know what else I can say.
You can say nothing.
I don't want it. I told you I don't want it. I never wanted a crown.
In earlier seasons, dialogue revealed character depth, letting us feel a bond with them. But here, that's all gone. If the lines were as brilliant as before, maybe it'd be interesting. Naturally, his "McQueen, you're my queen" line from Season 8 turned into a meme and got trashed.
You are my queen. Daenerys is our queen. She is our queen. She'll be a good queen. You are my queen. I don't know what else I can say.
You can say nothing.
She is my queen.
Jon Snow's backstory was one of the smartest and most incredible in the show. At first, we all thought he was just a bastard. There was a slight mystery about who his mom was, but we didn't dwell on it much. And why would someone as honorable as Ned Stark cheat on his wife and have a kid with another woman? But we just accepted it. Plus, we'd heard the famous story of how Rhaegar Targaryen kidnapped and raped Lyanna Stark, sparking Robert's rebellion. But as the show went on, whenever someone talked about Rhaegar, everyone spoke well of him. Almost everyone called him a noble guy loved by all. So two questions popped up in our minds as the audience. Ned Stark was so honorable, yet he cheated on his wife and had a bastard? And Rhaegar was so great, yet he raped someone and left her to die? The best plot twists are those that make sense and still shock you. Jon Snow not only isn't a bastard, he's the true heir to the Iron Throne, the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. George R.R. Martin weaving this into Jon's character was so genius, it's one of the smartest narrative decisions in TV history. This revelation didn't just change Jon, it elevated Ned Stark's honor to new heights. This man lied to everyone, even his wife, for nearly 20 years, claiming he'd slept with someone else and had a bastard. People mocked him, tarnished his honor, but he did it all to protect his nephew. For Ned, Jon's safety mattered more than his own honor. Ned Stark, a character who died 7 seasons ago, and we're still learning new things about him. This plot twist was so brilliant and crucial to Game of Thrones' story that Benioff and Weiss had to correctly guess Jon's parents just to become showrunners. Remember I mentioned that in Part 1? Jon Snow at this point was already an established fan-favorite character, but this twist had so much potential to make him one of the greatest characters in TV history. It was the best and most beautiful plot twist in TV history. But how does Jon being the heir to the Iron Throne impact the show and the final season? Almost not at all. All this revelation did was turn people against Daenerys and give her another reason to become the Mad Queen. The best plot twist in TV history ends up meaning next to nothing. Thinking about it still fills me with so much pain and anger. I can barely express it here. His character arc was made pointless too. He's a Targaryen, but the only plot impact is Daenerys getting mad. And in the end, they don't even make him king. He just heads north to do nothing. Oh, and with the Unsullied gone, who's even checking Castle Black to make sure Jon stays there? Moving on, let's get to Season 8's biggest crime, the nuclear-level destruction of Daenerys Targaryen's entire character. 7 whole seasons showed us who Daenerys was. Yes, she could be harsh at times, but she was a noble, loving person who spent her life ending slavery and helping the oppressed. Yet she gets vilified for things other characters in the show do all the time. Remember when she was judged for killing her enemies? The Tarlys refused to bend the knee, so she executed them. Then her allies started seeing her as evil for not sparing them. But Jon Snow did the exact same thing and was showed as a hero. Robb Stark did it too, and he was also showed a hero. But when Daenerys does it, she's showed like a criminal. She sacrificed so much for the Lords of Westeros. If it weren't for her, the Night King wouldn't have been defeated, and everyone in Westeros would be dead. Helping Jon Snow fight the army of the dead cost her 2 dragons. Her best friend died. One of her closest person who'd been with her the whole show was killed. A huge chunk of her forces were wiped out. And what did she get in return? Everyone tried to sabotage her quest to be queen, just because she might, I'll say it again, she might kill some innocents. Benioff and Weiss wanted it this way. They deliberately set it up so everyone would see Dany as a bad person, so when she's sitting on Drogon with the bells ringing, we'd buy her burning King's Landing to the ground. But sorry, no amount of gaslighting, trauma, or unfair treatment can convince me Daenerys would torch an entire city. Killing innocents for no reason goes against her character. Her core value was always protecting people from tyranny.
Blood of my enemies, not the blood of innocents.
On the other hand, suddenly, the people of King's Landing are worshipping Cersei? Why would they? They should have been terrified or rioting. After all, this is the woman who blew up the Sept of Baelor. Second, if Cersei's lying to them about foreigners coming to kill them, why is Daenerys mad at the people? She could have just raised the Red Keep to prove she's not a mad Targaryen. That would have gotten her revenge without harming innocents. Even if the bells were ringing, if she'd gone straight to the Red Keep and burned just that building, I'd have been on her side. But no, she had to commit mass genocide, so they can justify killing her off in the finale. Most Game of Thrones villains aren't black and white. Cersei had her kids, Tywin had his family legacy, Joffrey had his dysfunctional upbringing. They all had reasons for being villains. If Dany's turning into a villain, her descent into the Mad Queen should have been complex too, but it's an incomplete mess. The biggest screw-up is her torching King's Landing for no reason. She'd already won the battle. There was no motive to slaughter innocents. If Missandei's death was the trigger, it's hard to buy, because it wasn't developed properly. Between seasons 7 and 8, Daenerys and Missandei had maybe one 10-second conversation. If they'd built up their relationship, her death would have hit harder emotionally, and Dany's madness might have been believable. But as it stands, her death feels awkward, and Cersei surrendering? Who'd believe that? Now Daenerys' story ending can be seen in 2 ways, and both are depressing. First, the message Benioff and Weiss wanted to send. Remember how I said Jaime's message was depressing? Dany's is even worse. If her turning evil was justified, what's the takeaway? That no matter how much a character promises not to become like their evil parent, no matter how much good they do, they can't escape their bloodline because fire and blood is in their nature? That's the most depressing thing I've ever heard. Something Tyrion had said. The second way is to see her story as a tragedy. She did so much good for the world, only to be gaslit into committing genocide and then killed off. Now let's get to the biggest nonsense of the entire show. Bran's ending. Bran becoming king. That scene is so stupid it's hard to believe anyone could be dumb enough to write it. Tyrion says, a good king is someone with a good story. What kind of ridiculous logic is that? And the crazy part is, everyone takes it seriously. If you think about it, Tyrion's public image is trashed. He failed as Dany's hand every step of the way, and now he's picking the king of the 7 kingdoms? And why does Grey Worm even let him out of his cell? Then he picks Bran because his three-eyed raven story is the best. Like, does anyone even understand what the three-eyed raven is? And no one objects to the Starks taking over all of Westeros? Sansa makes the North independent. Yara wanted the Iron Islands free. Dorne wanted independence too, but there's no conflict. In earlier seasons, everyone fought for their own gain, but here they just quietly hand power to the Starks. And the dumbest thing, Bran says he knew everything, so that's why he came this far. So he deliberately let all this destruction happen just to become king? And Tyrion doesn't say a word about it. I mean, where did his brain go? And these are just a few of the things they completely ruined. How did this even happen? How did we get here? Some might blame George R.R. Martin for not finishing the books. Others might call Benioff and Weiss idiots. But Season 8's disaster happened because Benioff and Weiss rushed the ending. Wrapping up the Night King story and the show's climax in 6 episodes was impossible. This show shone because of its pacing. Characters developed slowly. Their flaws and relationships grew and broke over time. The longer it took, the more impactful the payoff. The Game of Thrones world felt vast because it used to take characters months to travel from one end of the continent to the other. But in later seasons, those trips happen in hours. Remember in part 1 when I said Martin didn't let Game of Thrones become a movie because the story couldn't fit in 3 hours? That backfired on him, because in the end, the writers tried to cram a 20 to 30 episode story into 6 episodes. And the worst part is, HBO wanted more seasons. Usually, studios hold writers back. But here it was the opposite. HBO wanted 10 or more seasons. But for some reason, Benioff and Weiss were dead set on ending it fast. I get it. They probably wanted to work on other projects. They'd spent nearly a decade on this series. Of course, they might have wanted to try something new. But then let someone else finish the show. I guarantee if Benioff and Weiss had handed it off and the ending still flopped, people today would be saying they missed the days when Benioff and Weiss ran things. Instead, they rushed the final season and ruined their Hollywood reputation forever. People now thankful that the guys who made Game of Thrones have nothing to do with House of the Dragon. So, Game of Thrones. What's its legacy after all these years? Sure, legacies can shift, but right now, its aura is one of what could have been. What if the show had run for 10 seasons and the story had room to breathe? What if Benioff and Weiss had stepped away and let someone else take over? What if George R.R. Martin had finished his books, so Benioff and Weiss didn't have to make up their own stuff? We can only wonder now. The reality is, the later seasons damaged the Game of Thrones brand in a way that might never heal. Look at the most popular franchises. They've got a contained, mostly brilliant story. Take the MCU. Phases 4, 5, 6, and beyond might have their messes, but phases 1 to 3, from Iron Man to Endgame, will always be legendary. But what do we say about Game of Thrones? That the first half was great? That just 4 or 6 seasons were good and the last 2 sucked? It'll never have that complete, perfect, brilliant story. Why are we still making videos about it years later? Because at one point, this show was so legendary that we'll never forget it till the day we die. It forced millions of fans to fall in love with it. That's why we can neither forget it nor ever forgive its finale.